Well, I'm sure this is one of your most anticipated sermons yet. You get to talk about anger. Everybody wants to deal with anger, right?
The topic makes me mad.
Now, when we come to the Sermon on the Mount, we've got to keep a few things clear in our minds. And one of them is that who is given this sermon? This is Jesus. He is our creator. He is the one who is the master of life. And he is not just giving us pretty words. He's not trying to impress us with his wisdom. He is going right to the heart of what life is all about. And so it's not insignificant that right at the very beginning, as he moves past his introduction and begins to talk about specifics, the first thing he talks about is murder. Murder. Anger. This violence. Isn't it amazing? You see the first two topics that he talks about. First, this whole area of anger, which is the match that lights the dynamite of murder. He goes on, then he starts talking about what? Lust. So isn't it interesting that all our movies, we have a code that warns us about what kind of content in the movies? That there's violence, and that there's sexual content, lust. So this is the nitty-gritty of life. This is where the world we all live. And so Jesus doesn't skirt around. He doesn't try to sweep these under the cover and just present, just beatitudes, these pretty sayings. No, he's going to some pretty hard areas of life. And why does he do this? Why does he do this? And we have to keep in mind that this isn't a random thrown together collection of sayings, as some people would want us to think. No, this is very, very well laid out, very logically laid out. And so as we came to the conclusion of the introduction, which concluded the Beatitudes, and then the thing we talked about last week about salt and light, that we are the salt and light of the world, and how this all relates to what they'd already heard, about the law and all those things, he now begins to enter into the sermon proper, into the body of his message. So if this was an essay, his opening paragraph was the Beatitudes and the salt and light and the thing about the law. And at the end of that introduction, he gives us the thesis statement. He gives us the main point of the whole sermon, that this is what is going to be referred to in different ways as he goes through. And it's this verse, chapter 5, verse 20, Jesus says, I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoa, that was a hand grenade that Jesus set off in the midst of a whole crowd of Jewish people who had grown up being taught by the religious professionals the authority of God, telling them how they're supposed to live if they want to live in right relationship to God. And here comes Jesus and says, they're wrong. Their righteousness, what they're saying about how to get into the kingdom of heaven, how to be rightly related to God, doesn't work. Because he says, unless your righteousness surpasses that, or is better than what they're giving you, you're not going to go into the kingdom of heaven. You can't enter it on that basis. That was a thunderclap of information that these people heard. Because they had heard, no. According to the authorities, you have to do this and this and this and this and this. So one of the things that's really key, because Jesus is going to refer to this as we go through. This whole sermon is the unfolding, expounding of what this thesis statement is. How do you get into the kingdom of heaven? How are you supposed to live in relationship to God? How are you to be acceptable to God, to be able to enter into His presence? And so far, Jesus is saying, you guys haven't gotten the right information yet. You've been sold a false bill of goods. And so He is going to explain, and He is the one who has the authority and the right to do that, since He is the author of life, the creator of human life. And it all centers around this one word. Unless your righteousness. What is that? What is that referring to? So it's really important, before we get into the whole anger and all that stuff, that we kind of break down what that phrase means, what that word would have meant to the people at that time. And so I'm going to refer to someone who's more knowledgeable about all this than I am, Dallas Willard, and take a look at what this means. Now, the word is the Greek word dikaiosune. I'm not sure, that's probably not how you would say it. Dikaiosune, something like that. Anyway, it's often translated as righteousness or justice. Those are the ways it's translated. So, how would they understand this word back in that time when Jesus is giving this sermon? So, he writes here, is a special term that played a large part in the thought world of classical and Hellenistic Greek culture, as well as the language of the Bible and in the early form of Christianity that emerged to conquer the Greco-Roman world of the 2nd and 3rd centuries. The search for something deeper had become a serious intellectual and spiritual project in the Mediterranean world by the 5th century BC, or even earlier. That search was, in fact, worldwide in scope, but nowhere did it achieve a higher result than in the great prophets of Israel, such as Amos, Micah, and Isaiah. Its first thorough and systematic treatment within the powers of human reason is found in Plato's Republic. So I'm not going to go into everything he says about that, but he says, the best translation of dikaiosune, the word righteousness, would be a paraphrase like this. Something like, what that is about a person that makes him or her really right or good. Sum that up would say, how do you become a good person? In the eyes of God and in the eyes of others. For short, we might say true inner goodness. Plato tries to give a precise and full account of what that true inner goodness is. This was something that they were really struggling with and trying to define and understand in the Greek world. The Old Testament books, skip that over here. As a result, the two greatest traditions of moral reflection in the ancient world are brought together. That's the Jewish and the Greek way of thinking. In the term, in this word, dikaiosune. It reemerges in the teachings of Jesus 3 centuries after the creation of the Greek Old Testament and becomes the central term in the understanding of Christian salvation represented in the New Testament. Indeed, for Paul, the redemptive act of Jesus becomes the key to understanding the very dikaiosune of God himself, the righteousness of God. It is the person of Jesus and his death for us that makes clear what it is about God that makes him really good. So when we see that word righteousness, focus on that first part of it, right. It's what makes us right, because since the fall of Adam, we're wrong. We're broken. We're not operating and functioning the way God fully intended for us to be as the people that he created. And so how do you get back to being right, to becoming good as God created? Remember when he created, he said he created all the things, the plants and the animals, and said it's good. And when he came to man, what did he say? It is very good. And that was the state that Adam and Eve were in until they disobeyed God and separated themselves from God. So how do you get back to that? That's what it means to enter into the kingdom of heaven. To enter into that state, like when we pray in the Lord's Prayer, your kingdom come, your will be done here on earth as it is in heaven. So we come back into a right relationship with God and other people. So that's what the sermon is all about. And so one of the first things he's going to deal with is what really upsets that whole process, what really interferes with that whole process. And the first thing is this whole issue of violence between human beings. And he focuses in on what is really the seed of all of it, anger. And I've titled it here on that outline, Anger, the World's Weapon of Mass Destruction. He says, you have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not murder. That's one of the 10 Commandments. And whoever commits murder shall be answerable to the court. So that was the standard. You can't murder somebody. They got that part right. But they figured out all kinds of loopholes around, what this is. So what's interesting as you go through this particular section, you're going to see Jesus said, you have heard that it was said, and he's going to refer to Old Testament teaching, understanding as people understood it then. And then he's going to say, but I say to you, which is a phenomenal thing, to set himself up as an authority to correct their understanding of what they had been taught. You have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not murder, right? Whoever commits murder shall be answerable to the court. And so in terms of human life in the world today, what is one of the very worst things you can do? Kill somebody, murder somebody. That is across all cultures, everywhere. And what is usually the penalty for that crime?
Bag.
Like in prison.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, in California, it would be life in prison, but if you were in Iran or if you were in somewhere else, it's going to be death. And that's been a pretty standard capital punishment. And so Jesus turns around and in verse 22 says, But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother or sister, wife, shall be answerable to the court. And whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be answerable to the Supreme Court. And whoever says, you fool, or the Greek word is raka, shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. He says everyone who is angry. Have you met anybody who has never been angry with somebody else in their life? Have you up to this point, are you anger-free? This is one of the most common responses to conflict.
Sure.
Is anger. It starts, babies are born angry. They're coming out of this warm, cozy environment, and you yank them out under, bright lights and cold and naked, and they're mad. They come out screaming. They come out crying. Well, it's a good thing. We know they're breathing, they're alive. But at the same time, it's like we're born angry. And we spend our lifetime trying to rein that in. So Jesus here talks about the crime and punishment of anger. So he says, everyone who is angry with his brother shall be answerable to the court. Okay, that's kind of like the first level, right? The court, judgment. There's going to be negative consequences to anger. Because what he's saying is, when he said, you shall not commit murder, whoever commits murder shall be answerable to the court, judgment. So there's judgment for murder. Now he's equating the judgment for anger with the judgment for murder. So he's saying these are tightly related. So the first is just kind of judgment in general. But then he goes on and he says, whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be answerable to the Supreme Court. That term, good for nothing, that's the word raka in the Greek. It's raka. It even just sounds violent. Raka. You call somebody raka. And that's basically what it's saying. Good for nothing. He's saying you shall be answerable to the Supreme Court. Well, in those days, there in Israel, who was the Supreme Court? That was the Sanhedrin. He's saying you should be dragged before the Sanhedrin, the ruling body of Israel, and be judged. That's serious. Not any old case got dragged up before the Sanhedrin to be tried. So he's starting with more of a general judgment. Now he's ratcheting it up. This is how serious it is, folks. This is a Supreme Court case. You should be judged for this. And then he goes on and he says, but whoever says, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the fire of hell. And unfortunately, we think what you're saying, when you say fool, you're saying calling somebody stupid. You stupid, or you idiot, or you nincompoop, or you knucklehead, or whatever. We're attacking their intelligence. That is not what that word means. Fool. The term fool in the Bible has a much wider and serious connotation. So in the Bible, this is when AI comes in real handy. I just type in and say, what's the biblical view of fool in the Bible? And so here's what it gave me. The term fool refers to a moral and spiritual condition rather than the lack of intelligence. While modern usage often implies a dullard or someone who is silly, The biblical definition describes a person who actively disregards God's word and chooses to live in rebellion against divine wisdom. The ultimate description of a fool is one who says in his heart, "There is no God." That's from Psalm 14:1. The fool has said in his heart, "There is no God." In this context, no God often signifies a belief that one's actions have no eternal consequences, no judgment, leading to corrupt and vile behavior. In the New Testament, Jesus warns against calling a brother a fool, raka. Oh, I guess that is raka. There, I got it backwards. Raka, in Matthew 5:22. This does not mean one cannot identify foolish behavior. Rather, it forbids using the term out of malicious contempt to suggest a person is beyond God's grace or utterly worthless. So you're in a very religious society. You're in a Jewish society. You know, their whole life is built around that they're God's chosen people. So you call a fellow Jew a fool, you're calling him a heathen, you're calling him a pagan, you're calling him an atheist. You don't even believe in God. That would have been like the ultimate insult to somebody back then. And that's why Jesus says, what's the consequence for that? They shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. Oh, that's like eternal punishment. And that's the term Gehenna, which referred to the garbage heap outside of Jerusalem that was constantly burning the trash and the garbage from the city. And that's where you get the image for hell, the picture for hell. So Jesus is saying, murder is not a capital offense that exists in and of itself. It doesn't come out of a vacuum. It doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from anger. Anger is the seed for murder. Generally, I'm going to say, well, of course, there's going to be exceptions to the rule. There's going to be people that murder somebody for something.
Financial gain.
You know, there's people who have murdered people just to see what it feels like to go murder somebody.
Right.
You know, and that book, Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, that's what that whole book is about. You know, somebody who thinks that they're above the law, they're above conscience, they can go just kill somebody randomly and it wouldn't affect them. And then he finds out later on that he is literally ridden with guilt, and actually becomes a Christian in the book. But sorry, I just ruined the plot line for so Jesus is saying, and this is the first indication we really get here in the sermon, that Jesus is going way beyond just the external obedience to the law. He is saying something deeper. Anger. Where does anger come from? You can hold anger without any outward expression. You can be a very angry person and not murder somebody physically, but you can be very angry and murder people and spiritually. You can injure and attack people spiritually. He's saying that anger is the root of that. So it's very serious. He's saying you have got to, as this title of this message is, practice the ruthless elimination of anger from your life. And that's what he talks about next when he says there, he talks about how to escape from anger. What's the Jesus way to escape from anger? What's the way to begin to achieve this righteousness that will enable you to enter the kingdom of heaven? He says in 5:23 and 20 through 25, he says, therefore, If you are presenting your offering at the altar and there you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering. Come to terms with your accuser quickly while you are with him on the way to court, so that your accuser will not hand you over to the judge and the judge to the officer, and you will not be thrown into prison. And you will not be thrown into prison. Therefore, I say to you, you will not come out of there until you have paid up the last cent. So Jesus gives us two very real life illustrations on how we can escape this hold that anger has on the majority of the human race. And what he's saying in these two illustrations is that you have to begin to practice extreme, radical reconciliation. This has to become your modus operandi. This has to become your way of relating to people. You aren't going to be a bridge burner. You're going to become a bridge builder. You have to practice extreme, radical reconciliation. So he gives this first one, and this is a religious illustration. So he gives this picture. So there's this guy, he's made the trek down to, he's speaking up there in northern Israel. He's up around Galilee somewhere. So most of the people there are people who live up in that region, even though they've come from all over the place to get healed. He says, so somebody's gone down, they've made this trek down to Jerusalem to go make their offering at the temple. They're standing in line, they've got their sacrifice, they've paid their money, got their sacrifice and everything, and they're waiting in line there to go and have their sacrifice offered. And all of a sudden, they remember something. Something comes into their mind. Oh, yeah. My neighbor Zacchaeus up there in Galilee, I think he's really angry at me. I don't know if he's, we had a little falling out and something happened, and I think he's probably still upset with me. So Jesus says, drop your sacrifice. If it was today, you'd say call an Uber, catch the nearest train, fly, head back up to northern Israel, which for these folks is, a trek of 3 or 4 days walking, and do what? Come to good terms. No, be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your. So he's saying, leave your offering there. Make arrangements. That would be a major hassle. Travel 3 or 4 days back up to Galilee. Make things right with your neighbor Zacchaeus. Turn around 3, 4 more days. Come back down to Jerusalem, and now present your offering. You know what he's saying here? Our relationship to one another is more important than our worship. He doesn't say, present your offering, take care of all that, then go up and go back home and do it. There's no sacrifice or anything in that. This is extreme radical. I mean, Jesus, he's making a ludicrous illustration, just like the plank in the eye kind of thing, to make a point. This is so serious. Forget the worship, get back up there and get right with your neighbor. And it's not because he doesn't remember this. He remembers that, oh yeah, I really sinned against him. I really need to go back and ask his forgiveness. No, he just remembers that his neighbor has something against him. He knows that his neighbor is probably angry with him. He needs to go and take care of that. It's that saying, what's the saying? The person with hurt toes is the one who goes. It's either side of the equation. And so this is a religious illustration for a religious society that would have made an incredible impression. Something they would never forget that they heard before. Every time as they're walking back up to Galilee, guess what's on their mind? Oh yeah, I remember my cousin Elizabeth, she's, oh yeah, these people that they need to get right with. And then he goes and gives a second illustration, and this one is from civil life, Somebody does something, you have to take it to, usually it would have been a priest or some kind of small claims court, to deal with these kind of claims. And so he says here, that you're to come to terms with your accuser quickly while you are with him on the way to court, so that your accuser will not hand you over to the judge and the judge to the officer, and you will be thrown into prison. Truly I say to you, you will not come out of there until you pay a last cent. So how do you come to terms with your accuser? This is the guy who's accusing you of either owing him money or doing something civilly wrong against him. How do you come to terms with that accuser quickly? You accept his accusation. You either pay up what he's saying you owe him, you admit you're wrong, and take care of that. Because if you don't, you're running the risk of getting thrown into jail, and you could be there for a long time, or into debtor's prison or something like that. It's a lot like what we do in court cases today. We get a mediator or something, and they settle out of court because, hey, you want to take the risk of going from a jury trial and wind up getting the full measure of whatever is allowed for your punishment. But the main point of all of this is that this is radical reconciliation. This is radical. You're taking the initiative to make things right with another person, and you go to extreme radical lengths to do that. That's how important this is. That's what he's saying. That's it. So we had that book that was really popular. I think a few of us read it. It's called Unoffendable. And that's what he's talking about here. We're getting to a point, you want to get to a point where you don't allow yourself to become offended, and which leads to anger. And so you can measure out steps to full out anger. Frustration is a form of anger that leads to that. You get frustrated and you get mad. You can calculate it. I remember when I worked in the print shop, and you try to fix something to get it to work right, and the more you did it, you became convinced that this was a sentient, intelligent creature, this printing press, and you're yelling and talking at it and stuff and hitting it until you realize this is dumb. And I've seen printers do some pretty extreme, angry things to their equipment. I saw one of my bosses once, the folding machine wasn't working right, and he pulled out the part, the major contraption that would fold the paper. He just yanked that thing off and flung it right against the wall. He was so angry. So, what Jesus is saying, and it's significant that he puts this right at the beginning of this sermon, is because he's saying you've got to deal with this. Before you move on to the next point, turn the video off, go and work on this, then come back and we'll move forward to step 2, which is the next thing. Because if you don't deal with this, the rest of the message isn't going to do you a whole lot of good. This is so critical and so essential. And I mean, this is, my mind always goes to this, and I've said this many times, is you just imagine what would the world be like if you eliminated anger from the world. You just have to release your imagination to think how different things would be, how so much would be eliminated, so many of the problems would be eliminated. And so for our own personal life, this is so critical. And it's significant, that Jesus here is focusing on real interaction. I struggle with, Deb and I talk about this a lot, I struggle with news broadcasts because you just get, it's like turning the oven on. It's like sticking your head in the oven and turning it on. It's like I want to get there and just get fed the stuff that's going to make me mad and angry. It's like, how can they do this? This is crazy. That's nuts. And in a sense, it's like those people, I don't know them. I don't have any relationship to them, and it's going to make any difference how mad I get, what they do or don't do. That's not really what Jesus is talking about, but it's something you have to deal with, because I think it's not healthy, it's not good. But he's talking about real life interactions. This was a society where people were much more interactive with one another than our society is. When Jesus says, your neighbor, they all knew who their neighbors were. We might not even know our neighbors, because people, we've got our garage doors open up, people drive in, close the door, go in the back way, never even hardly see them. So, what we have to do is, this is the principle of overcoming evil with good. We have to practice reconciliation. We have to be bridge builders. We have to be wanting and seeking good for others. That's got to be our goal. That's got to be our primary motivation, rather than if we're approaching life as what other people need to do for me, you're just going to be angry, because people are going to disappoint you all the time, from the checkout clerk to the closest relationship you have. You're constantly going to be disappointed and frustrated and experience anger. But if your motivation is to serve, to love, to do good, the Jesus way, that's what it is. And that's how God created us to live. And Jesus is saying that opens the door wide open for you to enter into the kingdom of heaven. Which is interesting, because he's going to talk later about that narrow path. That's the entrance to life, to the kingdom of heaven, and not the broad entrance way, road. So that's what I got for today.